Get that woman out of my boardroom before I have her escorted out in handcuffs." Harlan Voss's voice cracked like a whip across the polished glass table, silencing every breath in the room. The woman he was pointing at didn't move. She stood at the far end of the conference table, both hands resting flat on its surface, her dark eyes fixed on him with the kind of stillness that isn't calm, it's controlled detonation. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Voss, do you remember the name Cedric Beaumont?" The color left Harlan Voss's face like water draining from a cracked glass. The Meridian Group's corporate headquarters occupied the top 4 floors of a black glass tower in downtown Atlanta, the kind of building designed to make ordinary people feel small the moment they stepped inside. Everything about the lobby, the soaring ceilings, the cold white marble, the security desk staffed by men in identical dark blazers, communicated a single message: power lives here, and you don't. Harlan Voss had built it that way deliberately. At 61, Harlan was exactly the kind of man who believed he had earned the right to be terrible. He had grown up with money, multiplied it with ruthlessness, and spent 4 decades accumulating the kind of institutional protection that made consequence feel like something that happened to other people. The Meridian Group was the largest private equity firm in the Southeast, and Harlan was its founder, chairman, and unchallenged sovereign. His firm controlled hospital networks, affordable housing developments, municipal infrastructure contracts, and half a dozen public pension funds spread across Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas. He was also the man who, 12 years ago, had quietly and systematically destroyed the professional life and the financial future of a man named Cedric Beaumont. Cedric had been the chief financial officer of Meridian's Community Development Division, the part of the company, largely performative, that existed to generate goodwill and favorable regulatory treatment. He was a meticulous man, quiet in meetings, precise in his numbers, the kind of CFO who caught errors that no one else would ever find. He had found one in the spring of that year. Not an error, exactly. A pattern. $43 million, redirected over 7 years from federally mandated affordable housing funds into a network of shell subsidiaries that ultimately flowed back into Meridian's private equity returns. The money was supposed to build homes for low-income families in underserved communities across metro Atlanta. Instead, it had quietly made Harlan Voss and his inner circle significantly richer, while the housing projects stalled, were defunded, and eventually abandoned. Cedric had documented everything. He had organized his findings into a meticulous 60-page report with supporting bank statements, routing records, and internal memos. He had not gone to the press. He had not gone directly to federal regulators. He was a man who still believed, at that point in his life, that institutions worked the way they were supposed to work. He had walked into Harlan Voss's office on a Thursday afternoon in October, placed the report on the desk, and told Harlan that he wanted to handle this internally. Quietly, correctly, that he wanted to give the company the chance to make it right before anyone else saw what he had found. Harlan had smiled, shaken his hand, and told him he appreciated his integrity. That night, Harlan called his legal team and his compliance director and 3 board members who were directly implicated in the redirected funds. By Monday morning, Cedric Beaumont had been terminated for cause, specifically, for alleged falsification of internal financial records and misappropriation of company funds. The allegations were detailed, documented with forged internal audit trails that Meridian's lawyers had spent the weekend constructing, and immediately submitted to the Georgia Securities Division. Cedric's professional licenses were suspended, pending investigation. His accounts were frozen as part of a civil asset recovery action that Meridian quietly filed and then used as leverage to ensure he couldn't afford adequate legal representation. The investigation dragged on for 3 years. Cedric was never criminally charged. There wasn't enough fabricated evidence to survive that level of scrutiny, but the civil proceedings were sufficient. His career was over. His savings were consumed by legal fees. His wife, exhausted and frightened, left 2 years into the ordeal. He moved into a rented room in his sister's house in Decatur and spent his mornings sending out applications that were never answered. His name now permanently associated with a financial scandal that the business press had covered with the credulous enthusiasm reserved for stories that came neatly packaged from corporate communications departments. He died of a heart attack on a Tuesday evening in January, 7 years after Meridian had fired him. He was 54 years old, his daughter was 23. She had just finished her second year of law school at Howard University. Her name was Imani Beaumont. She had her father's eyes, deep brown, patient, precise, and her mother's jaw, which was to say a jaw that did not yield easily. She had been sitting in a federal property law seminar when her aunt called her to say that Cedric was gone, and she had sat very still for a long time after she hung up the phone, the case materials on her desk blurring in and out of focus. She had not cried in the law school building. She had walked to her car, driven to a parking garage 3 blocks away, sat in the dark on the 4th level and cried until there was nothing left. Then she had driven home and started making a list. She didn't finish law school to practice corporate law the way she had originally planned. She pivoted sharply, deliberately, the way a person does when their life's direction is reorganized by grief into something harder and more specific. She clerked for a federal judge in D.C. for 2 years, then joined the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Office of Inspector General. Not the glamorous posting, not the one her classmates were competing for, but the one that gave her access to the exact kind of financial records she needed. She spent 4 years there, learning the architecture of housing fraud with the focused patience of someone building something that takes time. Then she moved to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Atlanta. It took her 3 additional years from that point to build the case, not because the evidence was difficult to find. Her father had already found it, once, but because she needed it to be unassailable. She needed documents obtained through proper federal subpoenas, not inherited files. She needed cooperating witnesses who had been flipped through legitimate investigative channels. She needed the kind of case that couldn't be dismantled in a courtroom by Harlan Voss's $900 an hour attorneys, who were very good at finding procedural cracks and prying them open. She was 29 years old when she joined the FBI. She was 36 when she walked into the Meridian Group's headquarters, badged through security with a federal warrant, and rode the elevator to the 38th floor. She hadn't come alone. She had a team, but she had made sure she was the one who walked into the boardroom first. Harlan Voss had been in the middle of a capital allocation meeting when the conference room doors opened. He had looked up, with the expression of a man accustomed to interruptions being immediately apologized for. What he saw instead was a woman in a dark suit, FBI credentials in her left hand, and a tablet containing 700 pages of verified financial documentation in her right. He hadn't recognized her immediately. Why would he? She had been 23 years old, and grieving the last time anyone at Meridian had been forced to acknowledge her existence, and even then she had been handled by lawyers, not by Harlan himself. But when she said her father's name, the recognition had moved across his face like a cold front. The 11 other people in that boardroom went completely still. 2 of them, the CFO and the Chief Compliance Officer, both of whom had been employed at Meridian during the period in question, exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation about self-preservation. "You have no authority to be in this room," Harlan said, and his voice was doing something unfamiliar, something thin and reedy that his assistants had never heard from him before. "I want my legal counsel in here immediately. I want everyone else out." "Your legal counsel has already been notified," Imani said. She set the tablet carefully on the table. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "We served notice on your outside firm at 8 this morning. They've been aware of this warrant for 4 hours. I imagine they're already preparing for the press call. This is a fishing expedition," Harlan said, louder now, the volume substituting for the authority that seemed to be draining out of him. "Whatever you think you have. Federal warrant for the seizure of financial records, internal communications, and digital assets pertaining to the Meridian Affordable Housing Initiative fund accounts, fiscal years 2007 through 2014, Imani said, not looking up from the tablet, reading from the warrant summary with the unhurried cadence of someone who had rehearsed this exactly once and decided once was enough. Probable cause established on the basis of a multi-year forensic audit conducted in coordination with HUD's Office of Inspector General, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Georgia. She looked up then. She looked directly at Harlan Voss. "We've also obtained records from the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority and the Bank of Luxembourg pertaining to the Voss Family Trust and 3 affiliated holding entities. Those subpoenas were executed last Tuesday. The room had stopped breathing. Harlan's hand moved toward his phone on the table in front of him. One of the FBI agents who had followed Imani into the room stepped forward slightly, not blocking him, just present, and Harlan's hand stopped moving. "This is retaliation," Harlan said. His voice had dropped now, low and almost private, like he was trying to have a different conversation than the one happening in front of 11 witnesses. "You're Cedric's daughter. This is personal. Any judge in this district will see exactly what this is." Imani had been waiting for that sentence for 7 years. She had rehearsed her response to it in the car, in the shower, sitting on her couch at 2 in the morning, with her father's old case files spread across the coffee table. She had rehearsed it so many times that she no longer felt anything sharp when she heard it, just a deep, settled clarity. The forensic audit was initiated by a referral from HUD OEG in 2019, she said. "I disclosed my relationship to a potential witness in the matter to my supervisors at the time of the referral and recused myself from initial case intake. I was assigned to the investigative team 18 months later, after independent counsel reviewed and approved the evidentiary foundation as sufficient to proceed without conflict. Every step of this investigation is documented and has been reviewed by 3 separate federal oversight bodies." She paused. "So yes, it is personal. It was also done correctly. Those two things are not mutually exclusive." Harlan opened his mouth. He closed it again. Imani reached into the leather case she had carried in with her and set a single printed document on the table in front of him. It was a summary exhibit, 20 pages, color-coded, organized with the kind of visual clarity that had been designed for a jury, but worked just as well in a boardroom. The top line showed the original $43 million. Below it, a branching tree of routing paths, shell entities, consolidation points, and final destination accounts. At the bottom, highlighted in blue, were the names of the 6 individuals who had personally benefited from the redirected funds. Harlan's name was first, the families who were supposed to live in those housing developments, Imani said. She was still looking at him. 1,100 families. Over 12 years, they were placed on waiting lists for units that were never built because the construction funds had been redirected. Some of them are still on those lists. Some of them are not because waiting lists don't pause while people's lives collapse around them. She let that sit for a moment. "My father found this. He brought it to you. You destroyed him for it. Your father was." Harlan started. "My father was right," Imani said. "And you knew he was right when you shook his hand and told him you appreciated his integrity." The 2 words, his integrity, landed in the room like something physical. Outside the conference room's glass walls, the rest of the 38th floor had gone quiet. Assistants were standing at their desks, not pretending to work anymore. A paralegal near the elevator bank had her phone raised, then seemed to think better of it, and put it back in her pocket. Harlan Voss looked at the summary exhibit. He looked at Imani. He looked at the 11 people around the table, some of whom were already pulling out their own phones and quietly dialing, the particular kind of dialing that people do when they are calling their own attorneys, not their employers. "I'd like to speak to my counsel privately," Harlan said. "Of course," Imani said. "We'll be securing the server room and the records archive while you do." She nodded to the team behind her. They moved, efficiently and without drama, the way federal agents move when they've done exactly this before and intend to do it correctly. Harlan didn't move for a moment. He sat at the head of his glass table in his $4,000 suit, in his building, in his city, staring at the summary exhibit that his former CFO's daughter had just placed in front of him. And he looked, for the first time in perhaps decades, like a man who had run out of room. The subsequent events moved with the kind of deliberate, relentless momentum that characterizes federal prosecutions that have been thoroughly prepared. Within 48 hours of the initial warrant execution, the U.S. Attorney's Office announced a grand jury investigation. Within 6 weeks, indictments were handed down on 9 individuals, including Harlan and 4 members of his senior leadership team. The charges included wire fraud, conspiracy to commit housing fraud, misappropriation of federal funds, and obstruction of justice. The last charge stemming from emails recovered from the company's servers in which Harlan had, 11 years earlier, explicitly instructed his compliance director to bury the Bennett thing and make sure the source is fully discredited. He had meant Cedric. He had not considered, at the time, that the emails might still exist, or that someone might spend years specifically looking for them. The civil case moved parallel to the criminal one. A coalition of housing advocacy organizations, represented by a law firm that had been quietly retained and briefed over the previous 18 months, filed suit on behalf of a class of 1,147 families who had been placed on waiting lists for housing units that were never constructed. The suit sought recovery of the diverted funds plus damages. It also named Harlan personally. Meridian stock, which had been publicly listed for 6 years, dropped 40% in the first 3 trading days after the indictments were announced. 3 of the firm's largest institutional investors issued statements distancing themselves from the company's leadership. The board of directors, moving with the particular urgency of people who have just realized the ship is going down, voted to suspend Harlan as chairman pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. He contested this, lost, and was escorted from the building by 2 security guards. The same building he had designed to make people feel small, on a Wednesday morning while a small cluster of news cameras captured the image. Imani was not there for that part. She was in her office, 3 miles away, reviewing the first round of financial disclosures that Meridian's newly court-appointed monitor had submitted. There was still a great deal of work to do. There always was. The trial itself ran for 6 weeks in the spring. Harlan's defense team was formidable and expensive and generated an enormous quantity of procedural motions, most of which were denied. They attempted to argue selective prosecution, that Imani's personal connection to a potential witness in the case tainted the investigation's integrity. The federal judge overseeing the case, a measured woman in her late 50s, who had been on the bench for 19 years and had heard many creative arguments, reviewed the full recusal documentation and the OIG oversight records, and denied the motion in a written opinion that was notably unsparing. The cooperating witnesses were what ended it. 3 of Harlan's former lieutenants, facing their own charges, had taken plea agreements. Their testimony was specific, documented, and corroborated by the email records. One of them, the former compliance director, a man who had worked for Harlan for 16 years, testified that on the Monday following Cedric Beaumont's disclosure, Harlan had convened a 3-hour meeting in his office in which the fabricated audit trail had been planned in explicit detail. He had taken notes which he had kept, which were now in evidence. When the verdict came back, guilty on all 11 counts, Harlan sat at the defense table in a way that was notably different from the way he had always occupied rooms. He didn't slump. Men like Harlan don't slump, but something had vacated him. The animal certainty that had animated him for 60 years, the conviction that consequence was a geography he didn't live in, was simply gone. The jury foreperson read each count aloud in a clear, steady voice, and Harlan stared at the table in front of him and seemed to be looking at something a very long distance away. Imani was seated in the second row of the gallery, beside her aunt, her father's sister, the woman who had called her on the afternoon Cedric died. They held hands for the reading of the verdict. Neither of them cried. At sentencing, 2 months later, the judge ordered 14 years in federal prison, restitution of the full $43 million, and a lifetime ban from serving as an officer or director of any federally regulated financial entity. It was the maximum available under the sentencing guidelines, and the judge, in her remarks from the bench, was specific about why. The harm here, she said, was not abstract. 1,100 families had waited for homes they never received. A man who had tried to stop that harm had instead been destroyed for it by the very person he had trusted to do the right thing. That was not merely financial fraud. That was the deliberate weaponization of institutional power against an individual who had acted with integrity, and the court was treating it accordingly. Harlan said nothing when the sentence was read. His attorney said they would appeal. They did. They lost. There was a moment, in the weeks after the verdict, when a journalist from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution wrote a long profile of Imani and her father. The journalist had found Cedric's original 60-page report. Imani had a copy, had kept it for years, and quoted from it in the piece, describing the precision and care of Cedric's documentation, the clear-eyed moral seriousness with which he had identified the problem and tried to address it through proper channels. The journalist asked Imani how it felt to have finally gotten to this point after everything. Imani thought about the question for a moment before she answered. "My father believed in the system," she said, not naively. He'd been around long enough to know it was imperfect. But he believed that if you found something wrong and you documented it carefully, and you brought it to the right people, that would matter. That it would be enough. She paused. What I spent 12 years doing wasn't about proving he was right to believe that. I know he was right. What I did was make sure that belief wasn't what killed him. She kept one thing from the process. Not the verdict documents, not the sentencing transcript, not the summary exhibit she had placed on Harlan Voss's conference table. She kept the original 60-page report, in her father's careful handwriting, the margins annotated with his characteristic shorthand, the bank statement photocopies still paper-clipped in the back. She had kept it in a fire, safe in her apartment for 12 years. After the sentencing, she took it out and read it again, all of it, sitting at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning, with coffee she didn't drink because she forgot it was there. Her father's hand was in every page. She could feel the shape of his mind in the way he organized an argument, in the precision he used when he was most certain of something, in the small human note at the bottom of page 47 where, in parentheses, he had written, "These are real families," like he needed to remind himself, or remind whoever eventually read it, that behind the numbers there were lives that deserved better than what was being done to them. She closed the report and held it for a moment, the way you hold something that is irreplaceable. Outside her apartment window, Atlanta was doing what it does on a Sunday morning. Slow, bright, the city's hard edges softened by the hour. She could hear her neighbors moving around upstairs, a dog somewhere on the street below, the particular Sunday sound of a city that is, at least for the moment, at rest. She put the report back in the fire safe, closed it, and went to make a fresh cup of coffee.